Yeah. Okay, wonderful. All right. So today we're going to be hearing from four speakers who've been doing work at the intersection of sustainability and development. And if you're new to this series, then just a quick description of what we've been trying to do here. So we started in, I think it was early August, to have these conversations. And basically, we've been trying to kind of create this holding space for conversations at the intersection of different topics and development. So we've had a session on technology mediated mental health. We've had a session on community networks, on the future of work. And today we're going to hear from speakers who've been looking at the intersection of sustainability and development. And so asking hard questions at that intersection with regards to um, how we kind of resolve or are unable to resolve the tensions between these topics. And we'll go ahead and get started. I haven't planned out any kind of elaborate introductions, but first up we have Barath Raghavan, and he's coming from the CS perspective. He's faculty at USC, University of Southern California, in computer science. And so he does networking stuff, but he also is an expert on sustainability related topics. And I'm going to let him start. So,
All right, thanks.
what are we doing about slides, Bharat? Are you?
I'm about to share
You're
here.
okay. Wonderful. All
There we
right.
go.
Go ahead.
Hopefully you all see that. And I'm gonna hit present and then hope that it actually shows up, but I'm not sure. Do you see my slides?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
This
good.
works.
Okay, great. So thanks for organizing this, Neha. It's been great. That and one of the things I want to mention about my presentation today is it's going to be a little bit unusual in that I'm not going to. It's not going to be a complete presentation in some ways. In that I'm looking to those who are speaking after me to fill in some of the what do we do part of this, the computing part of it, and I can expand on that later. So, I want to talk about computing within limits, and really, this is about start sort of at a personal level of how have I come to this set of topics, and what do I mean by computing within limits? And so, what I'm going to try and talk about is, from my perspective, where are we headed as you know human species on Earth, and especially with relationship to these limits, which specifically I'm focused on ecological limits, and what can be done in response to them on a conventional level. So leaving aside computing, and then what should be done by me, what should be done by us as people who are computing researchers, practitioners. And so there's this word limits here. And so I just thought I'd define what it is that I mean by this. One of the things that I've been focused on for a number of years has been this question of uh, either hard limits in an ecological sense, non-renewable resource limits, those are finite resources that we are drawing down at a rapid rate. Eventually we'll run out of them. And these are across the board, but fossil fuels, of course, are the biggest one. And then softer limits in the sense that there's no hard ceiling, but that there are increasing consequences to sort of violating those limits. These are things like, the amount of greenhouse gas that we can put into the atmosphere, the amount of nitrates that can end up in soils or in waterways. These are kinds of things where we're increasing consequences as we sort of go beyond thresholds at which the ecosystem could absorb those. So these are the kinds of limits that I've been thinking about for a long time. And, I had interest in really or I'd say around 2005 was really when I started thinking about this stuff more actively and vaguely trying to think about how does this connect to computing and the research that I do. Sort of Jared Diamond's Collapse and a few other books that had come out around that time really got me thinking about that. And I started thinking, okay, well, my networking research has really nothing to do with this. So how do I connect the dots? And it's a really long way around to connecting those dots. And so first I started thinking about, okay, well, let me understand the big picture, the global energy picture. How do we use energy? What are the consequences of how we use that energy? And so I started at the personal level. There were a number of these sort of personal energy calculators that existed back then, that would look at things like, this is my flying energy profile, my food energy profile, and so this is my power consumption if you translate it into those numbers. And so then we had this question of, if you add up all those numbers, what is the total energy consumption? It's about 1,100 or something like that for me. And the average in the US is I think it's probably gone up a tiny bit in the last couple of years for me, but not much, mostly because of the flying and the food and the commuting I have very little of. But the overall, the average in the US is something like 10,000 watts. The average globally is about 2,000 watts. And so I've tried to target staying at that global average, but there's this question of, that amount of power consumption is not something that we can sustain. And where does that energy come from? A lot of it comes from oil. Oil is one of the most dominant energy sources. There's a lot of others that I can talk about, but I just wanted to think about this question of, why do we use oil? Why is this dominant energy source that, is ubiquitous and dependent on for transportation? It's because of the high energy density. Is really, there's all these other useful properties to it, but there's this high energy density. And I'm reminded about how the food side of this, that, as Michael Pollan points out, in 1940, the food system was actually a source of energy for us. That, that 2.3 calories of food energy is energy as well. So we can think of it in those terms. Were produced for every calorie of fossil fuel energy that went in. But now, as he points out, it takes 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce a single calorie of modern supermarket food. And that's a dramatic reversal. And food is, one of the most essential things for humanity, right? And so there's really this question of that the fact that we just don't have the kind of energy that we can, use on this. So, there's a whole sort of a line of thinking coming from this food question that, I'll talk about a little bit later. That's sort of one of the big focuses of my research these days. And of course, oil is in lots and lots and lots of things. And so, we kind of just take it for granted these days that oil is everywhere. Now, this is, natural gas is also everywhere, but we'll see. So oil is finite, fossil fuels are finite, just by definition. This is what we're dealing with. And so I've been looking into the question of, okay, we have these finite fossil fuels, but we also have this question of, okay, well, maybe we can improve efficiency somehow. So, if you do the numbers on efficiency, can we make things more efficient? That's a place where computing folks naturally go, right? We think, okay, well, we know how to make things more efficient in computing. Can we use computing to make, transportation more efficient, make, people use their light bulbs, turn off their light bulbs, right? There's all these sorts of nudges, and people have looked at a lot of these kinds of questions. There are gains to be had from an efficiency standpoint, but, if you look at the numbers, the long-term trends of these, we're looking in the couple of % per year range. So, meaningful, but not big enough. And the pressing matter, of course, is climate change. And, you all, I know, have probably read about and thought about climate change plenty. So I'm going to just briefly mention some of the things that I've been thinking about there. And so if you look at what the IPCC reports say, and each sort of revision, the numbers change slightly, but roughly speaking, what degrees C mean? You hear about these degrees C that, the planet is warming, there's certain thresholds, we don't want to exceed a certain threshold. What does that mean? So 1 degree, ice-free Arctic summer, polar solar ecosystem damage, coral reef bleaching, stronger hurricanes, erratic weather. These are all things that we are already seeing or we're about to see. And we are at, that 1 degree threshold. 2 degrees C, we see, lots of problems, expanded species extinction, the permafrost melt begins. Now, these are things sort of framed here from the IPCC's perspective in these sort of global consequences, but these then have ripple effects. The erratic weather then causes, a drought here and a flood here, right? There are these kinds of things that we're already seeing, these changes that have been happening over just the last few decades. 3 degrees C, huge rainforest loss, and, people who are water stressed at, billions of people scale, and lots of other unknown things start happening. And then it really just is beyond, we know that there are major problems out there, like end of ocean calcification and species extinction and so on. But these are things we don't even really know what's going on. These are written in the sense of like, we know that certain things are going to happen, but the real consequences are so unknown to us, the exact ripple effects on human society. And we're already at this yellow line. We're committed already basically to this red line, as I'm going to talk about. And we're told we shouldn't be exceeding this red line, but we're going to. And so what does that mean? And so if, Anderson and Bose make this point, and there's little or no chance of maintaining the rise in global mean surface temperature below 2 degrees C, despite repeated high-level statements to the contrary. And this is by doing an analysis of, you look at what countries have committed to, what they are planning on doing in the future. So that's a scary thing for us to think about. And here I am doing computing research. Well, what's the consequence to my research of these things, of the energy picture and of the climate picture? So we can change our behavior to respond to this, and computing can maybe help people change their behavior and use less. We can change our sources and try to find more. Computing is being employed by many companies, both renewable and non-renewable energy companies, to try to change sources, find more. So, the natural thing that societies try and do is they try and substitute. So, we see substitution going on right now in terms of changing sources. Tom Murphy has done, if you haven't seen Tom Murphy's Do the Math blog, and now he has a book, it's an amazing analysis of the energy picture of the world and all the different sort of renewable energy options that are out there. And so if you look at this chart, just to briefly tell you what he's sort of done here, is he's listed all the different renewable options that are conventionally discussed, and each column describes some property of it: abundance, difficulty, intermittency, is it demonstrated, can it make electricity, and so on. And these are all different properties that we would like out of an energy source. And since energy is one of the dominant challenges that we face in this picture, the limits that we're looking at, these are some useful properties to consider. If you add them up, and you could score them slightly differently one way or the other, but solar photovoltaic ends up being one of the best options among these renewable choices, and on down to ocean waves are particularly difficult to do it. So there's that kind of categorization. But if you compare it to fossil fuels, if you ignore the abundance, well, he doesn't ignore it, but he sort of gives it a half point for abundance. And if you ignore the climate change aspect, which unfortunately societies are largely doing, they score quite high because they satisfy all of these different needs. It's why we use these sources of energy. And so that is always a reminder to me that it's difficult to switch off of these fuels that work so well for what society is using them for. And we were long promised, and I remember as a kid, fusion was around the corner, and that we were going to switch to clean and plentiful renewable energy sources, but it hasn't happened. And so I want to understand, how is that going to happen? When is it going to happen? And is there a role for computing? But even if there isn't, how are these problems going to get resolved? And so Saul Griffith did this nice calculation and said, okay, the globe uses 18 terawatts, somewhere in that ballpark. So let's say we get a little bit back in efficiency, and now we've got to get to 15 terawatts. What's the pie look like? What are all the different sources of energy that are going to satisfy this? And so he just sort of gave a little bit to each source of energy and said, well, let's say we have 2 terawatts of wind and 2 of solar PV and 2 of geothermal and ... right? So said, let's say we do this over a course of 20 years. How much do we have to build to get there? Because this is an infrastructure problem. And so, his calculation was, roughly speaking, that we would, to get to 2 terawatts of solar photovoltaic, we would have to sustain 100 square meters of photovoltaic panels built and installed every second globally. And that 100 per second has to be sustained over 20 years. The same solar thermal, 50 square meters of mirrors have to be built and installed every second for 20 years. And then wind, these are 1,200-meter turbines. These are giant wind turbines, have to be installed every hour for 20 years, and so on. Nuclear, 3 new plants, 1 gigawatt plants need to come online per week, right? So these are some big numbers. And so I couldn't really tell, how big are these numbers? So I wanted to figure it out for myself. So I did a quick calculation and said, okay, let's take the most optimistic manufacturing capacity coming straight from industry, from these industries. What's possible? You get about 35 square meters of solar PV, probably large for solar thermal, though nobody's really calculated this. Wind, somewhere in the 5 turbines per hour range. And you see each of these numbers is falling short of what we'd actually need to deliver this power profile over 20 years, which is, roughly what the climate scientists say we've got to make this transition. So when you actually do the math on this, it turns out we're actually installing far slower than this. So solar PV, we're at somewhere in the 10 square meters right now. So we need this 20-year crash program where we transition our energy system globally. Even if we were to do that, as fast as we can go, we'd be about 50% short by sometime in the 2030s, a 20-year transition. So doing this math a number of years ago really made me think, okay, well, we have to figure out what we're going to do and what's going to happen. And so if we allow this to go forward, the limits to growth provides us a useful mental guide of what happens to a society in which you have a resource crisis, where you basically run short of resources. And so that's saying that we're going to give up our fossil fuels, or we're going to, we have some limit in the energy resources that's going to drive society. When that happens, you end up with a very rapid decrease in industrial output, in food production, and so on. We're probably not going to allow for that. So what happens if we say, well, we're going to bump up our resources through any means necessary, more mining, more drilling, and more renewables? Then we end up scenario 2. We have more resources. We end up in a pollution crisis because we didn't give up our fossil fuels and we didn't ramp up and transition to renewables fast enough. And the problems get delayed a couple of years, but the crash is harder. And so sort of thinking about these mental models of how, we might have to deal with these, on one hand, a pollution crisis, on the other hand, a resource crisis is pretty daunting. And so I'm reminded of this quote from 1974 from Carter: "We are grossly wasting our energy resources and other precious raw materials as though their supply was infinite. We must even face the prospect of changing our basic ways of living. This change will either be made on our own initiative in a planned and rational way, or forced on us with the chaos and suffering by the inexorable laws of nature." So that's really the conclusion that I ended up coming to, that the change will either be made on our own initiative in a planned and rational way, or forced on us. And so that's the choice that then I was looking at these numbers, looking at the climate picture. And so that brings me back to, the question that, I'd like to pose to everyone today: what does computing within limits look like, within these kinds of limits, within this kind of future? And what should we be doing about it? And so I'm not going to give a detailed answer of what should be done. I imagine that everyone else is going to present some of the pictures of what they think should be done. What I'm doing in my own research is looking at questions largely about land use and agriculture. Agriculture is one of the biggest consumers of fossil fuels in various forms, as the Michael Pollan quote points out, but also transformation of the land in a lot of other harmful ways. And so I'm looking at a lot of how do we design sustainable ecosystems that also produce food and that are multifunctional, so they can have many different uses that still provide food sustainably. So that's one line of research, and computing can be helpful in planning those kinds of agroecosystems out. So that's one line of work that I'm doing. I'm also looking at zero carbon computing, but computing is still a very small piece of the puzzle overall. And so, we have to be thinking about what computing can do out there, not just within the realm of computing, to deal with these large scale limits. And so that's all I have for today. Thanks.
Thank you, Barath. And I think that sets the stage perfectly for Bonnie to continue from here. So Bonnie Nardi is our second speaker. And Akhil, do you want to go ahead and share the slides? Okay, perfect. And she'll be talking about post-growth.
Thanks. Akhil, could you go to the next slide, please? Oh, wait, can I do this myself? Oh, okay, good. Okay, so I want to kind of pick up where I think Barath left off, which is to talk about the global political economy and why we seem to be using resources at the rates that Barath talked about, and so on. So I'm going to talk about post-growth philosophy and its critique of the current economy and its ideas for reorienting the economy. And then I want to talk in, I hope, some really practical ways about what we can do as academics. And this word post-growth has different flavors: degrowth, steady state, post-development. They each have their own nuances, but basically, oh no, I don't see the next slide, please, Akhil. But basically, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes just to make sure that I get this right. It's a philosophy of kind of an elegant downscaling of both production and consumption. So post-growth promotes modes of production and distribution not grounded in capitalist logics, but that rely on co-production with nature and are linked to political movements that challenge the capitalist calculus of growth. So right away, we're talking about politicizing the economy. The economy is not just a neutral thing out there. It's highly political, and solutions cannot merely be technocratic. We've tried this since the 1970s. Solar technology was available then. Do we have widespread solar? No, because of economic interests. So we have to take this a step further. The post-growth people are very adamant that compromises are not going to work. Avenues like the Benefit Corporation and the B Corp are presented as vehicles for the market's self-regulation. While they bring attention to sustainability, they fail to address a root problem as they continue to treat profit as an end in itself, encouraging the destructive greed inherent in a system that relies on the profit motive. So all of those numbers that Barath shared with us, those arise directly from economic practices, and that's what we need to deal with. Okay, Akhil, please. Thank you. Now, having said all that and having heard a pretty depressing presentation by Barath, I still feel optimistic. I think the world is going to change drastically, but I do believe what the post-growth people say about abundance, and they're not talking about having more stuff. They're talking about having more leisure, better social relations, more art and music. Post-growth is based on a premise of abundance, that there is enough to live a good life as long as ends are limited within what is generously made available by nature. And I think this is really it in a nutshell. How do we come together to find that abundance? Okay, next slide, please. And one of the things I really like about post-growth is that it draws on many cultural traditions. I think this is really important. So one aspect that you'll read about if you read the post-growth literature is voluntary simplicity. And this is an idea that came very directly from Gandhi. In 1925, this American philosopher, Richard Gregg, who liked Gandhi's ideas, went to India and spent time with Gandhi. He wanted to learn directly from him. And he learned what he could learn, and then he translated some of Gandhi's ideas into this notion of voluntary simplicity, which he thought Americans would understand. And he, in 1936, he wrote, "Voluntary simplicity is partial restraint in some directions in order to secure greater abundance of life in other directions. So this notion of abundance maybe came directly from Gandhi, I'm not sure. But I think it's a wonderful idea and it's optimistic and I think it motivates people. In the 1970s, Dwayne Elgin translated these ideas for a much broader audience in some of the stuff that he wrote about voluntary simplicity. And I'm pretty sure this is probably where the post-growth people have gotten their ideas. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. An example of post-growth thinking is the food sovereignty movement. Barath mentioned how problematic food is. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples and nations to create and maintain their own food systems, opposing the free trade model imposed by the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, and the entire system of capitalism. And this is from an article by Nils McCune, who is an academic who works very closely with the food sovereignty movement and writes about it. And here we see a direct political confrontation with capitalist logics. Again, it's not just that we come up with better modes of growing food. We already have those. We're not using them because of agribusiness and other forms of industrial farming. Next slide, please. Okay, so Barath alluded to all this. Here's what we have now. Monoculture, very bad practice, uses far too much oil, uses a lot of pesticides, destroys the land. Next slide, please. And what we want to go to, or maybe even go back to, is a more traditional polyculture. And yes, this is labor intensive, but the world is pretty full of labor. And if we learn how to do this, and you can do this in your backyard, I actually have quite a few things growing, and I know Barath does too. You can do a lot of this in your backyard and grow some of your own food. It can also be done on a scale to feed the world without destroying all our land in the process. And so these are the kinds of things that, like Nils McCune has chosen this as his research topic, I think we can do. Next slide, please. All right, so this brings me, so I think we've sketched out the problems, and they are daunting and they are massive. So what is it that we can do as academics? Well, I think that choosing our research topics to address these issues is the most important thing that we can do. And I think we sort of have a moral obligation. We're the only ones who have any job security anymore. And I think we should take some risks and not just use the university as a way to have a better life. And I know younger people worry about getting tenure. And I'm like, fine, wait if you have to. I can personally attest as an older person that you still have decades left to do good work. So I think that this question of like really interrogating yourself about what kind of problems, just like Barath has chosen food production, what kinds of problems sort of light me up that also address these big issues that we're facing. Next slide, please. I think we should emphasize scale more. We talk about scale all the time, but I don't see a lot about the global world system, about energy and ecology at a global scale. And I think we need to kind of confront that because the problems are indeed global. I think the small scale is important too. It's appropriate for understanding the potential for transformative change. And I've read everybody from Karl Marx to modern sociologists on what we do about how to sort of inject ourselves into these political and economic processes. And they all say you have to work at multiple scales. So whether you're more interested in the global scale or the local scale, that's fine. Just pick one or pick two, but understand that everything is all interrelated and that the global system isn't going away and it's always going to be there. Next slide, please. Another thing we can do as academics is to become familiar with talking about the economy. Thomas Piketty, who is a very world famous economist and wrote this wonderful book that it is 600 pages, but try to at least read part of it or read about it. It's a really neat book. He says economists know almost nothing about anything. So if economists don't know, then there's no reason for us to be shy about talking about the economy. And in computing, we study computing systems, we study social systems, and the economy is just another system. So becoming familiar with talking about it, I think, is important because it underlies all of those things that Barath was talking about. Next slide, please. I think we can recognize the influence and the platform that we have. As I was preparing this talk, I just ran across this little article on CNBC on degrowth. They were using the degrowth word. Scholars, this is the opening of the article, scholars are backing an idea that pushes social and ecological well-being over a system that pursues relentless economic growth. And it mentions a couple of academics by name. Post-growth came out of European universities. The ideas are older, as I've tried to say. But as far as it coalescing as a contemporary social movement, that happened within universities. So we do have a platform, and we shouldn't feel disempowered. We should actually feel pretty empowered, I think, and try to do something about these issues. Okay, next slide, please. I've been surprised and happy to see some of these ideas are entering the mainstream. There's a bunch of articles. There's even glimmers of legislative activity, like in India and Ecuador and New Zealand and other places. Natural entities like rivers now have legal status. This is kind of a weird idea. And I'm not saying post-growth caused this, but I'm saying it's part of the zeitgeist in which this kind of thing can happen. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the Powell memo, which I don't have time to go into in great detail, but please do look it up. In the early 70s, Lewis Powell, who later became a Supreme Court justice, laid out a program which has given conservative thinking a huge amount of influence in the US. And basically Powell said, you have to broadcast a consistent message, no matter how bizarre it seems, like that rivers can be legal entities, across multiple channels in order to gain your agenda. And he said, you have to look at education, mass media, think tanks, social movements, government. And now, of course, we have the internet, which they didn't quite have back in 1971. And I think it's really important that we understand that this beating of the drum over and over and over again with consistent messages is the way they become part of normal thinking and part of a broader agenda. Next slide, please. I think it's important that we don't invent the wheel, but that we adapt it to current circumstances. And I've alluded to some of this earlier. There are a lot of cultural traditions that we can draw from. Buen vivir, Ubuntu, Swaraj, indigenous philosophies from various places. And what they all, again, have their own nuances, but what they all have in common is that they emphasize community well-being, not individual well-being, not corporate well-being. They also emphasize non-exploitative relations with nature. And this all sounds like, yeah, of course, but these are in high contrast to the neoliberal notion of extreme individual liberty and lack of restraint toward the natural world. Barath talked about how much oil we're using and how profligate we have been. We don't have to be that way. Next slide, please. And I think that we're at a point when we can learn a lot more from these ideas. No, they don't tell you how to design a particular computing system, but they inspire you and they point you in the right direction. And we talk a lot now about reimagining and designing, and these words are good, but I think we have to be a little bit careful. They may connote that we are the agents imagining and designing, but I believe that others have imagined far more in some cases than we have, and that we can learn from them. We talk a lot about decolonial perspectives, and again, this is very good, but it shouldn't just mean that our technology and ideas and approaches can somehow be fit into local conditions. Quite the opposite. I think that we need to fit existing communitarian ideas appropriate to a planet of limits into our own practices. So I think there's a kind of embrace of these ideas that could be very beneficial that as an academic community, we haven't quite gotten to. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and I just want to close with recommending this wonderful book. Again, this is a book for inspiration. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is both a botanist at SUNY and a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. And what she does very beautifully in this book is to braid together the ideas of Western science and some of her own native traditions. And it feels to me like this is kind of exactly where we're at now, where we do have to draw on different modes of thinking, and we have to somehow find a way to bring them together. So I think that reading this book is one way to kind of get a sense of how we can do this in our own work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And next up, we have Anjali Mohan. And Anjali has been doing work at the intersection of, I guess, coming from an academic background and then working with government actors in the space of, decentralized socio-technical imaginaries as pathways to sustainable urban development. So with that, Anjali, go ahead.
Thanks, Neha, and thank you
Yeah.
very much to the organizers for having me speak of my work here. I will be using the case of Ranchi city and our research and interventions there that aim to enhance water resilience in the urban poor settlements of the city, which is located in the northeastern part of the country. We argue for decentralized socio-technical imaginaries as pathways to sustainable urban development. So the context for my talk is quite a bit laid in by the previous speaker, but I will still quickly go through some of these slides. Increased concerns on resource depletion, climate change, and conditions of inequality, especially in the global south, triggered largely by the economic growth development model, has actually led to a call for alternative pathways to ecological sustainability. This got edified in the call for sustainable development in the 1980s, which has in most of the global south, as well as in India, become an orthodoxy within the urban discourse. Now, even as this call for sustainable development gained momentum amongst international and national governments and policy, it is increasingly critiqued for its self-contradictory positioning, and that is what the previous speaker also spoke. So as it recognizes ecological limits, it is still pushing for accelerated growth, while unique panaceas such as green and inclusive, quote unquote. Now, in this context, there has been this call, a more radical call for steady state degrowth, post-development, post-growth economies, where sustainable development has got redefined to democratically led, redistributed downscaling of production and consumption with a focus on human well-being and socio-ecological limits. However, even as this theory has to be translated into practice, there is a need to engage with the socio-political structures of the global south. It requires us, or requires a disentanglement from the hegemonic models, development models that we have today, which are very dominant, to create spaces of cultural, political, and economic autonomy, where self-defined needs and targets are foregrounded. And it is in this context that we looked at the empirical specificity of increasing water resilience in the tribal city of Ranchi. And that's what I'm going to present to you now. To introduce the city of Ranchi, this was once a settlement of Munda and Around tribes. It is an emerging industrial metropolis with over 1.07 million people today. And the growth of the city was triggered largely in the late 1950s with a lot of engineering and mining industries coming up in this city. But it was only in 2000 that the city faced an urban explosion. And as in the rest, and this was when it became the capital of a newly carved out state of Jharkhand, which is also a tribal state in the country. So as in the rest of the global south, even Ranchi in that sense is typical because the urban explosion was accompanied by conversion of agricultural land, shrinkage of surface water bodies, groundwater depletion, and water pollution. In fact, water wars have become a recurring phenomena in the city of Ranchi and get reported fairly often in print and social media. Now, if you look at basic services, only 33% of Ranchi has piped water supply, and sanitation and sewage networks are even lower. At the receiving end of this urban explosion are the urban poor settlements, which are the least prioritized because largely they are categorized as slums, and these are the least priority in the formal planning and governance frameworks. However, in the case of Ranchi, these are the slums that we see in the city of Ranchi are actually the original tribal inhabitants around which, or the settlements around which the city has grown over the past 3 to 4 decades. Just to mention over here that by virtue of being tribal in nature, the Constitution of India does not allow the alienation of land amongst tribals. Therefore, these settlements, the original inhabitants continue to live in these settlements, and over generations, they have evolved and nurtured very strong relationships with land and nature. This is a sensitive relationship where sustaining both land and water is seen in everyday living of these tribal inhabitants. Water provisioning was largely through open community wells, tanks, and what the communities call water structures called dadis. And livelihoods continue to be agriculture and livestock rearing within the city. Yet there are certain externalities which have disrupted this relationship with land. Ranchi, as many other cities, is located along the Subarnarekha River, and most of these settlements dot the river and had a close relationship with the river. Now, the externalities have disrupted this relationship, and the poor in these settlements find themselves with no access to water or other basic services. The question in this context, we asked ourselves that how can we reimagine a resilience agenda, one that is a viable alternative to the pro-growth technocratic agendas that are that underlie the formal planning and governance processes. Wells in these communities are in a state of disrepair and disuse, even while there is no sanitation, and grey water management becomes a huge challenge. And it was in this context that we started to look at how do we revive and restore community wells, how do we look at grey water management, essentially to start looking at water security for these citizens. Of course, public health and gender became the other lenses that assumed importance as we moved. To talk of the action, we started with initiating collaborations, where as the technical partner, we worked with our NGO partner, the Mahila Housing Trust, who has been working in the city and 75 such settlements in the city for over decades now. And they have constituted citizen structures, community structures, such as the community action groups and women leaders who are called Vikasinis, who actually lead the movement and the interventions in these settlements. The community also became a larger stakeholder, and we did rope in the elected representative or the ward councillor. The intervention started with an in-depth study of the site, as well as framing the problems, understanding the problems from the community lenses. So we looked at what were the main concerns around water and sanitation from the community lenses, and the diversity between these lenses were brought on board. Solutions were also co-created along with the communities. And this was possible simply because what was mentioned also by the earlier speaker, that there is a certain relationship, knowledge of a relationship with nature that these communities embody, and traditional knowledge systems still exist within these communities. And this is what we leveraged. So even whether it was looking at wells and repair and restoration of these wells, or it was looking at grey water recharge management processes, what we relied on was passive technologies, which were largely co-created and along with the community and the larger basket of stakeholders. This is not to say that there were no challenges as we were moving on. There were challenges around, selection of wells, non-participation of certain segments of the community around land itself, where we wanted to institute some of these interventions. There were apprehensions on land being utilized for other things, but then negotiations and collaborations amongst the various stakeholders went a long way in addressing some of these challenges. While there were community structures that were instituted by Mahila Housing, the NGO that we were working with, but we did try to put in place certain processes which essentially looked at assignation of responsibilities amongst the various stakeholders. We signed non-financial MOUs with these communities, saying that the ownership was with the communities and they were supposed to drive these interventions. Bank accounts were opened, and meetings and targeting information asymmetries was is a recurring process within the communities. Awareness campaigns, once the wells were restored and grey water management systems were put in place, awareness campaigns around the do's and don'ts around each of these were taken up by the communities, as you can see, and a lot of it was done during the COVID. And as you can see, there was a lot of work that was happening around these wells in the year that has gone by. While it may be too early to perhaps be happy about it, but what we do know is, as of now, 6 to 8 months into the intervention, the quantity and quality of water has drastically improved. Water which was not potable earlier has become potable, and there is several parameters have changed, and there is a reason to celebrate. What is, of course, apprehensive is that how do we sustain this change? And that's what we are working towards. What I would like to mention over here is that all this intervention that we actually did within the settlements relied heavily on a lot of research that was done before, where we conducted household surveys. We tried to understand, what was the usage pattern of the communities, what was their access to the water facilities within the communities, where were the wells located, what was the quality and quantity of these wells, and also mapping a lot of these wells using GPS coordinates. We relied on this mobile app called Social Cop, and a lot of data was collected through this mobile app, which was then processed and then was used to inform the interventions. Mapping of wells, not just the intervention wells, but also within, say, about 50 to 100 meters of the well, other wells were mapped to understand, to kind of track the impact of this intervention and to see what is the impact on groundwater systems over a longer period of time. We continue with the post-intervention measures, where we are trying to understand again, doing household surveys, where we will understand the impact assessment, as well as look at some of the surrounding wells around the intervention wells, to understand what has been the impact of these passive technologies and to what extent it has helped in improving the groundwater situation in these communities. So in conclusion, essentially what we looked at a lot of, we worked along with the communities. We relied on traditional knowledge systems. These were diffused with technical knowledge on how water could be made accessible, how water could be made potable, how grey water management systems could be instituted in a decentralized manner for communities to access this and to have a better quality of life. What we do know is that innovation over here, while we did rely on technologies, but innovation over here is largely in terms of framing the problems, understanding these problems, co-creating solutions, and then scaling them. And it is at this scaling that we are right now, even as we speak. We are now expanding this program to over 3 to 4 settlements more, where we are looking at vulnerability mapping. So we are looking at climate change related stresses, whether it is heat or vector-borne diseases, or it is flooding or scarcity of water. And this, again, this mapping we are doing along with the communities. This is a recent FTD, that focus group discussion that we have conducted in the settlement there, to understand some of the concerns and how do we start to look at interventions which respond to these vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you also, Anjali, for all of the photos. I think that they really helped to kind of relate to the context. Okay, we're running just slightly late, so should we um, unshare this, Akhil? And Jay, would you like to? Okay.
Hey, can you see my slides?
Yes, that's perfect. All right, so next up we have our last speaker, Chen, and he's going to be talking again from a more computing focused perspective. Go
Great,
ahead,
thanks for
Jay.
the introduction, Neha, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. So I was going to speak more slowly because I speak too fast, but since we're low on time, I'll speak as quickly as I usually do. So my name is Chen. I'm a computer scientist by training, who sort of fell into ICTD during grad school, and during the last 15 years or so, I've been learning ICTD by doing ICTD. But I've only really been, reading and thinking about sustainability since about 2015, when Barath invited me to one of the first Computing Within Limits workshops. And I attended that workshop and subsequent iterations, as well as a couple of the co-located ICT for Sustainability workshops. So that being said, I feel completely unqualified to speak about sustainability. But here I am, and here we are, and so here it goes. So Barath's talk was full of facts, numbers, math, graphs, scientific evidence. If you're not already convinced that we are in the end game now, I doubt that any more evidence will suffice. And Bonnie and Anjali already suggested alternative ways of thinking about growth and maybe post-growth or degrowth and maybe what we should do. So my talk won't really focus too much on that either. What my talk will do will be pictures and speculation of well, what's kind of stopping us in my personal opinion. And so sustainability or development is the title of my talk. And sustainability and development seem both to be urgent and complex problems. So, given the finite availability of resources, the two goals seem to be fundamentally at odds, right? Both of them, or at least development specifically, is a resource allocation problem. And now we're, asked to allocate even less resources potentially to development, and that, is going to cause some pushback from us psychologically. So can we do both? How do we choose? Are there synergies or alternative conceptualizations that can maybe help us reconcile these two goals? Obviously, I won't be able to unpack, much less answer, all of these questions in just a few minutes. So my goal is to share some observations about our situation and hopefully meander us through some interesting ideas. So the future is already here. It is not just, it's just not evenly distributed yet. So this is a great quote attributed to William Gibson, a popular cyberpunk science fiction author. And in this quote, Gibson expresses the primary themes of the uneven distribution of technological advancements and the presence of the future within the present. The original quote was, I think, meant to describe how if you look at advanced economies or countries, that's the future. And if you look at less developed places, that they're living in the past and somehow, aspiring to or progressing towards the future state of affairs. And so, futurists and science fiction fans and techno-utopians love this quote, but it's actually highly problematic from the ICTD perspective. As if you've taken any ICTD class or you've done some reading, you'll know why, and I'll talk more about it. So however, it's a very interesting reference point, and that's why I have it here, and I'll be coming back to this shortly. So as Bonnie and to some extent Anjali discussed in their talks, our notions of progress are strongly geared towards production, consumption, and growth. And that needs to change dramatically if we're to tackle sustainability in any meaningful way. This is literally an existential crisis. I, like I'm sure many other of the ICTD faculty here on the call, teach an ICTD course. And in my class, we asked students to learn a little bit about the history of development. We traced the history of various conceptualizations of development and progress, and raised questions about development's economic-focused, capitalistic, techno-deterministic, and paternalistic preconceptions. And we asked questions like, is GDP a good metric for development? Is technology really going to solve any problems? Should we be driving development in other countries? Or should we actually be doing development, in scare quotes, in rich countries to improve our own systems so that we're less consumptive, predatory, and extractive? All very good questions. The consensus that we as a field seem to have arrived at is that GDP is not the best metric. Technology can't solve by itself anything, but it may help sometimes, and that we can still do development as long as locals are involved, not only in terms of participation, but also in terms of driving the research agenda. So questions asked, questions answered, QED, and we're back in business, but now with additional nuance. But we're still doing development in poor countries. And so the fact that there's 60 or so people in this call interested presumably in ICTD suggests that despite our assumed intellectual understanding of the hazards of both development and technology as concepts, we're reluctant to dramatically change course. And why is that? Maybe we're just compassionate people, or we believe in equity, or maybe we have a savior complex. So Joyjit Pal's paper, Kai for Good or Good for Kai, has tried to surface this and related issues, and it's certainly worth introspecting about and being critical about within ourselves. Or maybe we're just stuck with our notion of progress. And because of it, we can't come up with any other way of getting to the future that we want, other than to replicate the forward trajectory and the future technologies of the West. So what does the future look like? If you Google for the future, and Google is the de facto truth now, most images look something like this. More stuff, more high tech, more everything, and everything faster. Again, others have written and today talked about this cornucopian paradigm, and Bonnie's work touches on a lot of this. As Barath mentioned, there are several widely cited studies that indicate that we actually have very little chance to stay below 2 degrees Celsius warming this century. And if we don't stay within 2 degrees, just one of the results that we'll be seeing is dramatic increases in extreme weather events, which we're probably already getting a sneak peek of today. So the future probably won't look like this, and it'll probably look more like this. And this is a photo from the 2020 Southern California fires. Or maybe it'll look something more like this. And this is a photo from the recent Texas winter storms and power outages. So Gibson is right, but not in the way that futurists imagine. The future is already here, and it's just not evenly distributed yet. According to a 2019 Pew Research survey, the majority of American adults actually already believe this to some extent, maybe because the evidence is literally all around us. Most Americans expect income inequality to worsen over the next 3 decades. Majorities say that the economy will be weaker, the nation's debt burden will be heavier, the environment will be in worse condition, healthcare will be less affordable than today. Most believe that the US will play a less important role in the world. About 2/3 predict that domestic political divisions will become more pronounced. So we're already kind of aware of this. And here is for fun is the number of post-apocalyptic films released each decade from Wikipedia. I'm not a film studies expert or a psychologist or sociologist, but I would posit that this geometric increase says something about our growing collective concerns. Also, I checked, and the number of films released each year in the US is increasing roughly linearly by comparison. So as a development or sustainability person, what is there to do? Are these two goals fundamentally at odds? After all, there are limited resources. In 2016, I co-authored a short paper to the ICTD conference outlining the relationship and likely convergence of issues between sustainability and development or undevelopment of first world countries and the development of third world countries. So I want to say that when I was invited to speak today, I immediately remembered this brilliant paper and I was going to present it. But actually, I had completely forgotten until Barath reminded me that we'd written this thing. So being a sustainability enthusiast, I went back and I dug up this paper to see if I could recycle it. I was curious to know in retrospect, did we get anything right? And are there any useful insights that I can present today? So this is the abstract. In this paper, we consider the computing needs of undeveloping regions, regions that were formerly developed or developing, but are unable to cope with fundamental limits. And then we contend that the ICTD community will have unique contributions to make in addressing these challenges. We obviously aren't the first to consider the collapse of civilizations in this paper, but the observation seems timely given what has happened since then. And so the parallels between development and undevelopment seemed apparent and worth considering at the time, but the reviewers evidently didn't agree. The paper was soundly rejected. The comments were to the effect of, in quotes, the precise definition of undeveloping areas is not clear, and you can practically include all nations, which I think entirely missed the point. In fairness, it probably was out of scope for ICTD. So why am I even bringing this up today? Mostly to feel vindicated, but also in part because it's a nice segue into a more systemic problem that I think our field and other people in general have, or people in general have, not other people, of being unable to see the forest for the trees. I, like many others, some very senior folks within ICTD and varied other fields, have observed and lamented for quite a while now that our fields seem to be increasingly stuck doing incremental work, producing least publishable units on topics that don't really matter. Whereas ambitious, novel, or big ideas get nitpicked to death for superficially reasonable reasons. And there are various structural causes of this that I won't really get into, like the tenure process, the publication cycle, and so on. But I think there are also psychological reasons as well that prevent us from thinking bigger and more broadly. This wouldn't really be a concern. I would be happy to have people navel gazing all day, writing random papers, but the consequences of inaction are really dire. And given these major problems, we as privileged members of the academe need to really step up our game in a major way because we can't rely on Mr. Elon Musk to terraform Mars. Maybe things are improving within ICTD with the reconception of ACM Dev as Compass, which is going to bring sustainability and crisis under the umbrella of social good. But I don't think it's going to be that easy. We as people, not just academics, tend to draw sharp disciplinary boundaries and are therefore unable to see relationships and the bigger picture. We're stuck in this dualistic thinking that goes back to Descartes or maybe Plato. And in ICTD, we're supposed to be interdisciplinary, but we're sort of just duct taped together like this. There's the people that do technical work, and then there's the people that don't do technical work. And, oh, that stuff is interesting, but that's not what I do, and I don't really understand it from either side. And so this issue isn't really just an ICTD problem. Some very thoughtful HCI papers, like some of Bonnie's work or the feminist HCI literature, touches on some of these issues of dualism. But I don't know how much it really gets across because, let's be real, who has time for this stuff? Only, you know, retirees and, well, academics like us. Arturo Escobar also has a great summary and discussion of this issue in his book, Designs for the Pluriverse, which he calls the three fundamental dualisms, the dominant form of Euromodernity, the divide between nature and culture, between us and them, and between subject and object. So basically, dualism seems to permeate Western thinking very broadly. I won't get into monism, but it has its own flaws. Everything is connected, as Bonnie mentioned, but not, you know, in a very flat way. So conceptually, our models should really look something more like this. I'm not a Taoist, but I think there's something to be learned from this. The world is composed of many different, sometimes opposing aspects that can coexist and even complement each other, with the seeds of the other included in each aspect. So, you know, all boundaries are somewhat vague, and this is true of physical boundaries and of abstract category boundaries. And this is a quote from David Chapman, who has a blog called Meaningless that you should check out. So instead of thinking in terms of sustainability or development, maybe we should consider sustainability and development. And while that is the title of this X4D section, I don't think that we're really thinking in this way. So if we do reorient and broaden our view of who and what it is we are sustaining, rather than thinking about contexts as being separate, we could consider how they're related facets of the same systemic problems. And incidentally, that's what some of the papers that I've written have been doing. So coming back to the Carter quote that Barath showed, this change will either be made on our own initiative in a planned and rational way or forced on us with chaos and suffering by the inexorable laws of nature. What is chaos and suffering? Well, as we run out of cheap natural resources and climate change intensifies, economic pressures and environmental shocks will affect vulnerable populations. This future will consist of diminished socioeconomic well-being and decaying infrastructure punctuated by increasingly frequent humanitarian crisis as our current and future efforts to maintain growth result in increasingly extreme pressures. And so when these inevitable humanitarian or economic crises occur, the affected community will survive, suffer, die, or migrate. And as we've seen, this future is already happening during the Syrian conflict and refugee crisis subsequently. And so, you know, who is it that's going to suffer the most? Well, it's typically the poor people, right? The people that have the least infrastructure, that are the most vulnerable to shocks of various kinds. But debatably, it's going to be the rich people too. Because developed countries have no lower infrastructural equilibrium to rely on. When things come crashing down, we're going to fall a lot farther. So if we think of collapse in this way, then crisis events are no longer signs of imminent collapse. but rather collapse events themselves, and thus the future is already here. And from this perspective, the field of crisis response is a reaction to collapse. The development is a reinforcement against collapse, and sustainability is an attempt to prevent future collapses. Interestingly, these three separate fields that focus on different population groups and timeframes are separate fields. But can you tell from this picture which of these three fields this problem belongs to? I certainly can't. So I think we have the same goals, and we really should be learning from each other and working together a lot more. And so I wrote a paper in 2015 outlining the similarities and differences between these three fields and the various potential synergies. Here's a random list of commonalities in no particular order. And if you look at this list and you're an ICTD person, you're kind of already familiar with most of the issues on this list, right? And they're all issues of sustainability as well. So really, you are the potential experts. The sustainability folks have their own conceptions in mind. I won't get into their biases. But I wrote another paper in 2016 on the challenges and potential strategies moving forward. So if you want more details, you can try to Google those and find both of the limits papers online. So other than the idea that crisis, development, and sustainability are related issues tied to the same underlying foundations, I guess I would like the key takeaways to be something like this. Recognize myopia and bias. I've only talked about one example. If you do, Google the Wikipedia page for cognitive bias, you'll see an even longer list than the list of the science fiction movies that I showed. Number two, be open-minded about disciplinary boundaries. Try to think bigger and broader. And if you're suffering from decision paralysis because you can't come up with something big enough, then do some small changes to salve your own psychology in the meantime. And then help and educate each other. And I guess as a plug for Limits 21, if you're interested in sustainability and basically joining a cult, come attend Limits 21. It's June 14 to 15 and it's virtual. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have some questions. I guess Kentaro has a question that ends with thoughts. I haven't read everything, but maybe we can have you bring up or speak up, Kentaro.
Sure, yes. Thanks to all the speakers for their contributions. I tend to also agree and align with the various predictions of future challenges, possibly even more pessimistic than some of you. But one of the things I noticed that in most cases, there were either explicit or implicit critiques of the research community, or whether it's the one that you happen to be in or in general. But it strikes me that we're in a world now where we understand these problems quite well. I have not really heard that much new in terms of knowledge of what the potential dangers are, even today. And at the same time, we also know that there are lots of solutions that are out there that, if we were to implement, would address many of these problems, possibly even get us to a point where we could actually continue to do well as a civilization. Given that, is this really a research problem? And should we think of the contributions we can make as research contributions, or, extrapolating this critique? I would argue that research itself is not really the main activity that we need, and that we need to, even though we might be, professionally researchers, that what we really need to do is think about how else we can change the world separate from our identity as researchers. So I just want to know, just want to ask all four speakers if they had any response to that.
So I don't know, I can start. Yes,
yeah, sure.
I agree with that. That's how I've been seeing my own work. And so I see myself as, I'm a researcher because that's what I've been trained in, but largely I'm looking for ways in which I can take my research and, actually implement it. And one of the challenges, and this is something that Jay raised, these don't align with the incentives of what you're supposed to do. It doesn't align with cranking out papers. It doesn't align with grants. And so, all the things that we're supposed to do. And I've just sort of come to terms with that's the way it goes. And so, I agree with you. I see being a researcher or being in academia, the only advantage it has for trying to tackle some of these problems is that at least there are no sort of business incentives that are forcing, for example, like Bonnie pointed out, cycles of, increased growth of, some companies' bottom line, right? So those kinds of incentives don't exist as much. There are other incentives that are not helpful, but at least you get to step away from that and then have an opportunity to go in a different direction. So that's kind of what I see, the benefit of being in an academic position, but only if you then take it and use that privilege of having that freedom to go do something, actionable, meaningful. And so I try to do that.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you on an emotional level, I think, Kentaro, but I also think that the world is changing really fast, like incredibly fast. And I don't think we've done all the research. And I think that there is a lot of room for research. I don't separate research out in my own mind anymore from politics and the economy. And I think that one of our challenges is to see that they are linked. Just as humans are part of nature, research is part of these bigger processes. And I think if we can kind of think more deeply about that, that might make our research more effective.
Yeah, I guess I'll go. So I agree with what Barath and Bonnie have said. I think for me, what Bonnie said is it just organically has happened, right? You start thinking more and more about these issues. I think, the definition of research varies. I think what I'm trying to get at is that, conventional research isn't really going to move the needle, as Kentaro points out, and really we need to think way, way outside of the box. Outside of the box is basically what Bonnie is saying, right? Is that, politics is part of research. I mean, you're a computer scientist. What the heck do you know about politics? Well, you should learn and figure something out, because that's the kind of research that we need.
Anjali, would you like to add?
I think I was, I straddle both academia and practice, but then as you could see from my presentation, I'm more into action and more into practice. But that's what I personally feel that the two are not, it's difficult. If you're into action, it's better to be able to support it through research. And the two are intrinsically connected. Now, that bridge is very difficult to actually, I would say, straddle. So I also find it very difficult. And one of the things then I kind of miss out on is writing or publishing on my work, or because it's just impossible to do it. I tried for a couple of years and it doesn't work. But then I think it's a choice that we make. Where do you want to do more of? It's the entry point. Do I want to do action and then back it up with research, or do I want to do research and see where I can get an opportunity to translate it into action? So it's a choice that we make. And I understand where a lot of academia comes from, and there is that whole idea of publishing and tenure and all that, but I guess I'm a little outside that now.
Thanks, Anjali. Thank you, everybody. So Gregory has a question for you on how you personally navigate that. Do you want to share how you? Yeah.
So I'm not too sure if I really navigate that. I do a lot of research and I inform my practice through research. But as I said, to what extent I'm successfully navigating it, I don't know, because I don't have many publications. I don't end up writing too much, because that itself is a full-time job, I realize. And if I have to do that, then I miss out on a lot of other things. So that's what I said. I think it's a choice you make, and where do you want to keep your entry points? I guess I'm just more of a practitioner than an academic. But I do teach, and I bring in all these classes and all these cases into the classroom. And one thing I do know is that my students love it. They just love to listen to these cases, engage with them, learn more through it. But at the same time, I am critiqued because a lot of my professors feel that the classes have to be more about a sense of curiosity, which gets lost through these cases where there are very definite answers. So I don't know. I don't know how I make whether I really navigate it or not.
Yeah, I think this is really great. When I saw that work, I felt like it was this really beautiful combination of really doing something that kind of like action research. And I see that you're kind of crafting this practice in the academic space to really be making a difference and doing stuff. And I think a lot of us are really interested in that. And I wouldn't necessarily downplay it. Like, it sounds like it's really hard and that you haven't found like, oh yeah, I figured it out and I'm grooving, you know, right? So I agree to that, but I mean, don't downplay that. I'd really like to hear more about that. It's I loved everyone's presentations, but yours was the one that was the most feeling like, oh, this is more towards doing something that I would, yeah, like doing more things like that. How can I do that? So I don't know if there's papers or other things you've written about that, or if you teach classes about it, that I could like watch you talking to your students or something. I might not know the languages involved or something, but that's what I'm kind of curious about, how to do more of that thing.
If I may just take another minute, I think one of the positive things that has happened is that there is a lot of research, action research that is getting funded now. So even the work that I did in Ranchi, which started off with just my NGO partner, it became the basis for a larger research that I just got granted. And when I was seeing out of some 300 applications, they have shortlisted 5, and many of them are straddling practice as well as research, academia. So I think that perhaps for me, from my lens, is a positive move. So I think there is a bit of a shift over there.
Thank you, Anjali. Lily, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your really wonderful talks. Something that stuck out to me is a lot of you, I think all of you are computational, but a lot of what you were talking about were really at the interface of these like social facing issues and focusing more on that and focusing on sort of like the challenges of development and undevelopment and everything. And I guess my question is about like, how do you navigate the trade-off between trying to be like a good computer scientist and a good researcher in that space, but then also having to be an expert in this other area to work successfully. And I know that I had spoken previously with Barath about how he likes to be sort of an expert in the domain that he's working with, but that's very hard to do while also trying to be a good computer scientist. So have you had like very successful collaborations working with these kinds of interdisciplinary partnerships, and how have those formed or worked out? Or have you tried to like work more with computer scientists? Anything that's sort of that tension with what to personally focus on and then who else to work with.
I mean, I can go, I guess. I mean, so Lily and I have talked about this before. I mean, because a lot of my sustainability interest comes from personal interest, so outside of computing, it's been more of me merging my outside sustainability agriculture interests with my computing interests, rather than me coming at it solely as a computer science researcher and then going out there and trying to learn it. And so, I guess I could say I sort of developed that body of knowledge organically, but then there's still tons of stuff in agriculture I didn't know. And so the way it's really worked out is finding people who you like to, I mean, this is sort of a rule of thumb in anything, right? Finding people you like to work with who think very differently than you. And so I have, one core collaborator and some sort of, additional collaborators who are pure agriculture researchers, but think from a sustainable agriculture perspective. The way they think about the problems in the world and how you even frame what agriculture is, it's just a different way of looking at things. They run into this same sort of institutional barriers on their side as we run into on our side, that these kinds of topics are marginal in agriculture. He sometimes tells me that to the old professors in his department in agriculture, even organic is like, why would we even think about that? Who even bothers with organic, right? So forget about like more holistic, ecosystem-based agriculture. That's just way too far afield from what they think is acceptable research. So, we run into the same thing in doing sustainability and doing ICTD work in computing. It's, not the mainstream thing within computing. And so, there's some shared bond there, which actually you can build upon, that, both sides are taking a step into the unknown. And that sort of fuses you together and, gives you more confidence in some ways to pursue it. I think that's a big piece of it, that, doing this kind of work, it's going to be hard to publish. you know, you have to learn to speak to the other side and understand even what they mean. So there's a lot of that, and it's really just through discussion that I think you can form those bonds. And so I think it's useful to really deeply understand the other side, because otherwise you can end up doing sort of superficial work. You know, and for me in agriculture, I really want to know what's going on the agriculture side, not just sort of get data from them and then crunch on my side, you know. But you know, I'm sure everybody else has some other comments on other fields than agriculture.
Yeah, I think the key word in this question is collaboration. I think finding collaborations is really important. I was trained in anthropology, so working closely with computer scientists has already been a huge stretch for me. And I don't know as much about computing as I would like to, but I work with smart people who do. And so that makes up for a lot of the shortfall. So I think that you're asking the right question about finding collaborations and going beyond your own boundaries. I do think that's really important.
I think, so just to add to what has already been said, so it's not just collaboration between disciplinary boundaries, but I think just in increasing the stakeholder basket itself, and then looking at collaboration against, amongst, you know, what would I say? Not the usual stakeholders, is something that I think a lot of good research can also leverage. And that's what we have realized. It's not just communities, but even within communities or around communities. For example, your elected representatives, as we have been working with for a while, and there is a lot of knowledge that exists there. There's a lot of experience that lives there. So I would just say, just to expand that collaboration to the non-conventional stakeholders also.
Thank you, Anjali. I think next we have Curtis and then Raj.
Yeah, so thanks, of course. I'm really curious about, and I'm having a hard time putting this together, so let's see if you guys can deduce what I'm asking. There has, like, you've been beating the drum of limits and a little bit of collapse now for a while. And in my own experience, I often suggest my students engage with the limits community. I love what you all are doing. I think it's a fantastic space to think about. But the sort of cultural norms of collapse and limits vary seemingly widely. As a quick example is sort of, if you go to particular branches of evangelical thought, like climate change is fundamentally impossible. The world is given to us by God, and so it cannot be changed. How have your experiences been taking this message into a broader global context, and what kind of barriers or sort of winds at your back have you seen in this messaging? There's a feeling I have that this messaging is kind of, I'm not to say exactly Western, it's just like a very sort of, there's a community that really understands and latches onto collapse and limits and these elements, and that bringing that message along with me has not always resonated. So I would like to hear y'all's experiences.
Neha, can I quickly add? I have a very similar, this is Rajesh, very similar question to Curtis.
Sure.
So I had, you know, he put it more eloquently than I would probably ever dream of. But I think what I was trying to ask is whether, is this targeted at people like us and people who are aspirational, who are poor, who would, if you say post-growth, they'd be like, well, you know, let me get my kids to school, let me get my get 3 meals a day. So I wonder whether, you know, I mean, I'm in full support, and you know, and all for all the discussion, but I'm just wondering whether you've thought through, you know, post growth to people who are poor.
Yeah, that's a really good question. My feeling is that the stakes are very high now, and that we're all going to sink with the ship if we don't think about how to reduce consumption and waste production. And so whether you're rich or poor, it's going to hit all of us. I don't expect poor people to necessarily take on these burdens themselves. And that's why I emphasize that there are people who are in these positions of privilege like we are, and we have to kind of do what we can from within the academy, from within action research, with teaching, as Anjali pointed out, whatever it is, because the problems aren't going away. And the best approach that I have seen is the post-growth approach, but if there's something better, I would like to hear about it. But I think we need to keep searching and acting and speaking.
I guess what I'd say here is that I've been taking the sort of the old saying, think globally, act locally, but at a conceptual level rather than a geographic level. So I've been thinking globally in the sense of thinking about issues of limits and less about collapse specifically, but more about limits generally, but then acting locally in sort of a domain specific way. So in the context of agriculture, in the context of computing and energy, so on, right? So then when you engage with the people about food production and how to do it sustainably, I don't have to get into the discussion of where is the world heading and is the limits to growth right and all these other questions and what's the latest climate science. It's about can we produce the same amount of food with less inputs and with no harmful chemicals. If we can do that, then then there's sort of it's aligned with the incentives of the people on the ground who are interested in that. And so that's kind of how I'm seeing it. When it comes to computing, if we're trying to do zero carbon computing, well, if we can do that using free electricity that's being produced by surplus renewable power, which is the case now, which is very strange. But then we have not enough at other times, then it's a win-win there too. And so I guess I'm kind of looking at it that way. And I would say that I see the limits community as being, it's really for all the folks who are on this call. It's about having a space for discussion for us to think about these ideas. And then we go out into the world and try to, do something with that knowledge, with that thinking. Oh, and just a brief thing about the growth. And, the growth has become, it's become conflated with the solution to all our problems is the way we use the word now. And as a result of that, we forget what I like Herman Daly's phrase of uneconomic growth, that we are in a world now of uneconomic growth, where the growth that we get in sort of numerical growth, we don't actually see the benefits of it. And sometimes we see harms from that growth. And so, that's, at least for those who are sort of conversant with or thinking of from an economic standpoint, that's a useful frame. And also the post-growth and degrowth framing like Bonnie had talked about. But for most folks, I don't think about it in terms of growth and not growth. It's more of, how does this affect your life? And then it's sort of a domain specific thing.
Yeah, and to go back to the Powell memo that I mentioned, back in the early 70s when it was written, people like Noam Chomsky and Angela Davis were considered almost normal. And that's what alarmed the conservatives. That's what pushed them to do everything that they did in the 70s and the 80s to attain their own agenda. So I think this idea of picking up your ideas and just beating the drum over and over again, yeah, you're not going to succeed right away, but that seems to be the path that eventually leads to success. And as problems get worse, which they are kind of almost on a daily basis, I think that people are more open to listening to what they would have considered radical ideas maybe even 5 years ago, maybe even last year.
Yeah, so don't lose hope. I guess from my perspective, the talk that I presented offered no closure, right? It wasn't really prescriptive. I think the talk was targeted for this audience in the sense that that's what I was invited to talk about. I think you can look at it from various different angles. One of which is, we are the most equipped one of the most equipped set of people to think about these kinds of challenges. Another is, I don't think that it is the case that poor people are supposed to shoulder the burden of degrowth. I think that like I said, we have a lot to offer rich countries. In fact, we could do some degrowth in rich countries,
You're muted, Jay.
What was it?
No, you're good.
Okay. So I think there are potential opportunities in research to not necessarily even do degrowth, but what is the right term, to buffer against collapse, right? This collapse informatics space. I mean, that's kind of what we're getting at with the undevelopment paper, which will not see the light of day.
So as we're wrapping up, I think we're just at time. One thing I wanted to ask, because there's folks organizing Limits and Compass here. So are there spaces at these conferences that you think we could continue these conversations? What would be the
Yes.
forum to target?
I mean, we would probably have, we're going to have breakout sessions at Limits. That's going to be in June. So, you know, this is very much within the kind of discussions we have at Limits. So, you know, hope to continue with them.
And Curtis?
I mean, yes, of course, not to cannibalize Limits at all, but if there's full papers and you want to submit on Compass, I would be very excited for working. I don't think that we've gotten so far in the formalizing breakout sessions, but this would be on my short list for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think we're at the end of this session. Just wanted to mention we already have the next session planned. We have the speakers set, so we'll share information about that soon. We're very excited. This is one session actually that Dhanraj Thakur volunteered to organize, and so it's going to be on privacy and participation in social media, and that will be on April 20th. And if you're interested in organizing or co-organizing a session on something the following month or later, then just get in touch with Akhil or with me. So I don't know if there's a question here, Daniel. I guess it's chat. Yeah, so if you wanted to get the chat from us, if you can just shoot me an email, I can share the chat with you. I'm not sure why it's not downloadable. But yeah, I think we're done. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, all of the speakers. This was really a great conversation. And we'll see you next month. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.